Good Monday morning, everyone. Welcome to Monday Mornings at Maine. My name is Heather Miller. I'm an adult programming librarian here at the La Crosse Public Library. We're so glad you could join us this morning. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. We do have a chair fitness class every morning prior to the presentation at 9 o'clock. Then, of course, we have time for our coffee and conversation at 9:30. And each week we have a lovely speaker to come and present some local information, entertainment, history, things of that nature. So thanks again for joining. Today we have Julian from the National Wildlife Refuge Systems. We'll be talking about 100 years of conservation efforts on the Mississippi River. Before we get kicked off, I just wanted to make one quick announcement. Next week, we'll actually be meeting downstairs in the auditorium as Main Hall will be getting prepped for voting on Tuesday. So again, next week we'll be downstairs in the auditorium with Brutus the Mini Pig on April 1st. So no fooling, it's going to be a lot of fun. So we'll see you downstairs next week. Feel free to grab a cup of coffee and get ready for the presentation. So please welcome Katie.
Well, hello, everyone. Thanks so much for coming out on a chilly morning. And what month is it now? Sometimes it's a little bit hard to tell. I'm super excited to be here today to tell you a little bit about the 100th anniversary of the Upper Mississippi River National Wildlife and Fish Refuge, where I am one of the refuge rangers. How many of you have been to the refuge before? Okay, wonderful. Awesome. If you have been to the Mississippi River in our area, you have been to the Upper Mississippi River National Wildlife and Fish Refuge. The refuge is a pretty big place. It's a pretty unique national wildlife refuge, being that it's 261 miles long. It runs from Wabasha, Minnesota, down through Rock Island, Illinois, and is about 240,000 acres in size. An acre is about the size of a football field, so you can imagine that's a pretty big place. Most of the refuge is actually right on the Mississippi River, and it's comprised of river habitat, marshlands, sand prairie along the river, and braided forests or braided river channels of the floodplain forests. And with those different habitat types, there are many species of wildlife that call the refuge home. So we boast more than 290 species of birds move through the refuge across the year, across that whole 260 miles. There are more than 119 species of fish that can be found in the river, more than 40 species of mussels, and more than 50 mammals. So a pretty incredibly diverse place. We are one of more than 568 national wildlife refuges across the continental United States. Our mission is to provide habitat, particularly for migratory wildlife. So you can see all of the little black dots on that map show where there are wildlife refuges across the United States. And if you notice any patterns in them, they tend to be concentrated along the flyways for migratory birds. And then you see quite a few up in North Dakota, where the prairie pothole region is, where there are grasslands interspersed with wetlands that provide the perfect habitat for grassland nesting birds, which many species of ducks are grassland nesting birds. And that is their critical habitat for many species. I work out of the La Crosse district of the Upper Mississippi River Refuge. So currently there are 4 different districts that work together to manage the refuge. We have a really nice visitor center up north of Onalaska and Bryce Prairie. And we manage about 50,000 acres from the La Crosse district in pools 7 and 8. If you haven't had a chance to come out to the visitor center, it is free to visit. In the winter, from November through March, we're open Tuesday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. And we'll soon be starting Saturday hours again in April. April through October, you can come out anytime Tuesday through Saturday at 9 to 3 p.m. We have scavenger hunts if you have grandkids, children in your life, backpacks that folks can check out to explore the trail system. We have about 2 miles of trails that go through the sand prairie. And we have lots of recommendations for other places to get out and explore and really get to know the refuge. We also have a ton of free events going on for our 100th anniversary this year. I have brochures up here on the table. There's a website, uppermiss100.com, that our partners have sponsored. And there'll be activities going on all throughout the districts on the river. So please feel free to check that out to find out more about upcoming events. And the La Crosse district will have a big family-focused event in June, Saturday, June 22nd. We'll have some live animal programs, activities for all ages, barge boat tours. We're really looking forward to that. If you didn't get a sticker, I also have fun stickers to celebrate the 100th anniversary. So if you didn't grab one, come grab one after the presentation and you can help us celebrate all year round. So today, when I was asked to come give a presentation about 100 years of history, it is a pretty overwhelming amount of information to try to condense down to 45 minutes. I decided to focus on the early years of the refuge, the first 50 years, partly because it's harder to find that information, and it's a pretty interesting history of how the refuge got started. I'll talk a little bit about some of the major events that shape both the physical and social landscape of the refuge, and then just a little bit about how you can get involved and help us shape the next 100 years to come. I also want to acknowledge that the research that I've done is just a tiny piece of what all of the information that's out there. I looked through our annual narratives that staff kept dating back all the way to the 1930s. I found newspaper articles. Winona State has an amazing newspaper archive that I found lots of information in the 20s and 30s about what was happening on the refuge. I also found some pretty neat oral histories with refuge staff that are available through the National Library, and some historic publications from anywhere between the 40s and 70s that help tell the story of what was going on the refuge. But again, it's just a little piece of a vast and rich history, and I'm sure many of you have stories from your own experiences or families and friends that help add depth to this history. So I hope today to just give you a little flavor of what was happening on the refuge across those 50 years, but I know it's just a little piece of what we could dive into. When I started thinking about 100 years of history, it felt like both a very long time and a very short amount of time. My grandmother was born in 1924, the year the refuge was created. So to think of 100 years as really just being 2 lifetimes is pretty incredible to see the amount of change that happened in our country in that period of time. So I wanted to kind of set the scene of what was happening in the 1920s and how did the prior history shape that time period. So if this postcard is from the 1800s in La Crosse. At that time, we were coming out of the Gilded Age, where we had the rise of industry, the rise of cities, really shaping that like early industry along the river. As the cities grew and industry grew, there was also the changeover to the progressive era from the 1900s to the 1920s, which was kind of a counter movement to the negative side of that period of growth. So in the 1900s, 1920s, you've got the rise of child labor laws. Women gained the right to vote in 1919. It was also Prohibition period, where it was illegal to sell alcohol, kind of a social movement and protest to kind of the unruliness of cities at the time. At this point, it was also a fairly exploitive time for natural resources, as the industries were growing. There really was no regulation of the logging industry, of municipal waste, of industrial waste into the river. Natural resources were kind of seen as being inexhaustible, that we could take whatever we needed and that nature would provide and it would all come back. The photo that you see here is a woman holding ducks. Wildlife were really exploited both for food, to feed people in the growing cities, and for their feathers and furs, which were very popular for fashion at that time period. I mentioned that there was really no regulation of industry, and that meant at that time the water quality was pretty poor. Much of the wetlands were being drained to create space for cities and for agriculture. And we were seeing pretty sharp declines in pretty much all species of wildlife. So the first federal efforts to try to help out wildlife populations were really interested in production of how do we bring back these wildlife species for commerce and for food. So in 1871, the U.S. Commission of Fish and Fisheries was created by Congress, and their job was to figure out how to regrow the food fisheries, particularly along the East Coast. That later became the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries and led to our National Fish Hatchery System. So if you've had a chance to get down to Genoa National Fish Hatchery, the hatcheries predate refuges, which was pretty neat to see. One of the things I found fascinating about that period of time was in the 1880s, the U.S. Commission of Fish and Fisheries stocked millions of fish into the Mississippi River in an effort to try to repopulate the river again. They tried both native and non-native species, but of course the native species we have here were most successful. If you can imagine at this point, it's before the lock and dams were created. So you had all these little narrow braided river channels where you have water moving through forested areas along the river. So there were a lot of really diverse types of fish habitat out there, but it was also a very seasonally wet environment. So parts of the river would flood in the spring and fall and create these little temporary wetlands alongside the river. And I found it fascinating to hear that one method of restocking the river was to actually hire people to go out with buckets and send nets, go catch the fish that were in these seasonal wetlands, and literally carry them back to the river. So I read somewhere that 50 men were hired every year just to do this job of catching fish in the seasonal wetlands and moving them back. And it became a more advanced field as technology advanced. So they moved from pretty much just hand carrying fish in buckets to actually being able to load them into special train cars and not only stock fish here in the Mississippi River, but also to other river tributaries. So they developed special trucks for moving fish and train cars for that purpose. And we actually still use those special trucks in the national fish hatcheries to be able to help stock fish across the country. So pretty phenomenal to see 1880s fish rescues were the way to go about restocking populations. It was significantly cheaper to just save the fish that were here than it was to try to grow them again. So when it came to being more wildlife focused, I mentioned that the early interests in wildlife were mostly about industry, agriculture, economics. So the first wildlife-focused federal bureau is the section of economic ornithology in the Division of Entomology in the Department of Agriculture. And all of that long title means that the Department of Agriculture was looking at the benefit of birds and controlling insects in agricultural lands. So as part of that task, scientists were sent out to try to quantify what birds were out there, where did they live, and then how did songbirds impact insect control on agricultural lands. So that division of entomology later became the U.S. Bureau of Biological Survey that eventually is renamed again and became the Fish and Wildlife Service that I work for today. A pretty interesting origin story for Fish and Wildlife. Our mission as an agency is working with others to conserve, protect, and enhance fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the continuing benefit of the American people, which is you. We are one of the only federal agencies whose primary mission is wildlife conservation. We've since been moved into the Department of the Interior, and we work alongside agencies like the U.S. Geological Survey, National Park Service. If you think of Bureau of Land Management, there are other federal agencies, but we're the only one whose primary mission is conservation. So at this point in time in the 1900s, there were very few laws that were regulating how wildlife was being used. And one of the first organizations to really step up and try to figure out a way to protect wildlife was actually the Audubon Societies. Something interesting to me was that the first Audubon Society was started by two women, as a way to protest the use of feathers in women's fashion. So they started the Massachusetts Audubon Society and were trying to get women to stop buying feathers. They also were very influential in petitioning Congress. They successfully got President Theodore Roosevelt to create the first national wildlife refuge in Florida in 1903. It was called Pelican Island, and at this point, many of the birds like egrets, herons, ibises were very popular birds to shoot for feathers. So this refuge at Pelican Island was created as a safe space for those birds. They also hired the first official game wardens. So the gentleman in this picture is a man named Paul Craigle, and he was hired to work at Pelican Island. And other local Audubon societies followed suit. So in Florida and South Carolina, local societies would hire men to protect specific tracts of habitat for wildlife. The sad part about that was that it was still so lucrative to harvest birds for their feathers that two of those gentlemen lost their lives in duty, that they were killed by poachers while trying to protect those lands. I believe that was in 1905, and that started an even more fervent effort to petition Congress to protect wildlife. So finally, in 1918, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is created, which puts all migratory birds under federal protection. So those were some of the first laws protecting wildlife. As far as the refuge's creation story, one of our key players is a gentleman named Will Dilg. He was a Chicago advertising executive in the 1920s. He actually worked for an alcohol company and was out of work during Prohibition. And he used to take the train from Chicago to come up to the Winona area. And he bragged that he spent more than 60 days a year fishing on the upper Mississippi River. And in the 1930s, or I'm sorry, early 1923, he heard of a plan to drain the upper Mississippi River to turn it into agricultural lands and lands for industry. And he petitioned his friends, Chicago businessmen, and said to turn that land into a national wildlife refuge. And something that I found particularly interesting about him is that his background as an advertising executive meant that he had a very persuasive way with his words and very influential in talking to people about creating the refuge. He was also driven by personal tragedy, and that his son sadly drowned on the refuge when he was a little boy. And that really led him and his wife to very passionately work towards the creation of this refuge so that every child would have the opportunity to grow up and enjoy the natural resources in the state that they were. So I have a little excerpt from Outdoor America, which is a magazine that was created by the Isaac Walton League. Will Dilg was the founder of that organization, and at this time, mass communication was kind of a new thing where people were starting to have radios in their households, telephones, rise of electricity, ability to really send out a lot of information at a time. So Outdoor America was one of the ways that the Isaac Walton League was very influential in spreading the word about what was going on in the world of wildlife. He says, veritably, these river lands offer you and your boy and posterity the greatest sport to be found on this planet, but it's going to go. These river lands are going to be drained all the way from Lake Pepin, Minnesota to Rock Island, Illinois, and once drained, they're gone forever. Will Dilg was probably influenced by his friendship with John Latch. If you're interested in local history, John Latch was a philanthropist from the Winona area who at the same time had started buying land and giving it to state agencies for the same purpose of trying to protect that land in perpetuity for people to be able to get out and enjoy. The Isaac Walton League was also a really interesting and influential organization in that they really reached out to many different types of organizations. Certainly they reached out to other conservation groups, but one of the biggest wins for the creation of the refuge was that Will Dilg reached out to the Federation of Women Voters. The Federation of Women Voters was an umbrella organization for women's interest groups. So they had communications with about 1,200 different women's clubs at the time. And if you think in 1923, it's just a few years after women gained the right to vote in 1919, and there were lots of women who were very eager to be heard. So in reaching out to that Federation of Women's Clubs, Will Dilg started a letter writing campaign to Congress to get anyone he could to write to Congress in support of the creation of the refuge. And amazingly, they were very successful. And 11 months after they started the campaign for the refuge, they were able to get Congress to pass an act establishing the refuge on June 7th, 1924. Also partly able to do that because they gained the support of Herbert Hoover, who at that time was the Secretary of Commerce. And having that influence of powerful people really helped a small group of people do something pretty big. So when you look at the early years of the refuge history, this photo is from the 1920s. Our first staff on the refuge were mostly based in the Winona district out of Winona, Minnesota, and they included both a superintendent. William T. Cox was the first superintendent on the refuge. He was appointed by Congress to that role, and he, at that time, was the state forester of Minnesota. And the other folks on this crew are attorneys, engineers, land surveyors, and foresters. And one of the first tasks that they had to go about doing was buying the land for the refuge. So I mentioned the refuge is 261 miles long. That was the tract of land that is in the Congressional Act as part of the refuge boundary. And in order to buy that land, they had to convince people to sell it to them. And in the Congressional Act, they were only allowed to charge up to, or to buy it for up to $5 an acre. And as you can imagine, it wasn't the easiest thing always to find the landowners who didn't necessarily have a household on their land. They had to do it all through phone calls and mail, and it required more than 4,000 transactions to be able to actually buy the land that created the refuge. And it wasn't overnight. By 1926, 2 years after that Congressional Act, 110,000 acres of land had been purchased, so about half of what the refuge is today. I had to enjoy some of the early pictures of posting boundary signs on the refuge. The staff complain about how much time it takes to do that, and it still takes us a lot of time today, so something that hasn't changed throughout the years. This boat is the USS Widgeon. It was what our early staff lived on as they underwent months-long time to go map out the refuge lands. There also weren't really pre-existing maps of what that refuge land looked like. So they were going out to quantify what types of trees were out there. What did the habitat look like? How was it shaped? So the gentlemen in this picture again are an attorney for the refuge, one of the refuge managers, a forester, and their driver, their boat driver. So one of the other things that was interesting to me about how the refuge was shaped throughout the years is that I mentioned today we have 4 different district offices, but throughout history, we've had anywhere between like 4 and 9 different districts on the refuge. Really up until the late 60s, most of the district offices had only 2 staff, and the deputies were only hired part-time, were kind of on call to do work. So the early refuge rangers in my role were primarily law enforcement officers. They had a ton of different duties to do, but it took a long time to be able to communicate to the public that it was now a national wildlife refuge and that there were different rules for trapping, for hunting, for fishing than before it was a refuge. They had a series of cabins up and down the river where the refuge rangers lived in the wintertime. So in addition to going out to do law enforcement activities and to try to do some biological surveys, they also had to spend some time fighting fire. Again, in the early 1920s, this is before the lock and dams were created. So as the water levels rose and fall, sometimes in the summer, the refuge would get very dry, and wildfires were fairly common at that time. So they write about staging firefighting equipment up and down the river to be available when needed. And then some of the narratives, they talk about hiring more than 60 people to serve as essentially fire scouts looking for wildfires popping up on the refuge. So also at this time, besides just trying to quantify the wildlife, they had to think about how to keep them on the refuge. So I mentioned that industry had come, agriculture had come, but the lumber industry had been in its boom times in like 1880 to just into like the 1910s. So there wasn't necessarily the same quality of habitat that we see today. So one way to be able to offer food for wildlife in the winter months was to do supplemental feeding. So they'd set out corn feeding stations for upland game birds in the wintertime, which is what is in this picture. And then they also planted agricultural crops, and they would leave them standing over the winter to provide food for wildlife. One of the things that they write about at this time is that they were hesitant to do a whole lot of habitat management work, because even at this point, there were conversations going on about deepening the navigation channel on the river to 9 feet. And they knew that it probably wasn't worth putting a lot of time into changing the landscape if it would soon be covered with water. I enjoyed this photo. These are refuge staff who are loading or unloading bags of corn to go out to feed to the birds. And in one of the Winona Republican Herald articles I found, it says, "Birds must be fed regardless of sub-zero weather. Rangers cover up to 20 miles a day, restocking a series of feeders with grain, corn, and grit. Upland game, pheasants, quail, and prairie chickens migrate from the surrounding territory into the river bottoms." So there's quite a few pictures of staff on skis with toboggans going out to fill these feeders in the wintertime, which would have been a kind of fun, interesting way to spend the winter. So shifting it more into the 1930s, some of the major events that really shaped the management of the refuge were Aldo Leopold's publishing of Game Management, a textbook all about how we go about wildlife management. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. In 1934, the federal duck stamp program is created, which proved to be a primary funding mechanism for purchasing more land for refuges. And then, of course, the lock and dams totally changed the shape of the environment. So if you haven't heard of Aldo Leopold before, he is a noted Wisconsin conservationist. He had his start working for the U.S. Forest Service. And while he was there, part of his duties were to patrol Forest Service lands for predators. And at that point, wildlife science felt that if we remove predators from the landscape, it would allow other game populations to flourish. But what he found in that job was that if you remove all of the predators, he was actually seeing wildlife populations like deer starve due to overpopulation as those populations outgrew the size of their habitat. He also had opportunities to work with soil and water conservation districts and really get a very holistic view of what habitat management meant. That wildlife conservation wasn't just about producing particular game species, but also about trying to create the best possible habitat to support those populations. So he was hired by the University of Wisconsin to teach a graduate level course in wildlife management, which was really the start of professionalizing the field of wildlife management. And his textbook on game management really changed the way that conservationists or wildlife managers thought about the work that we did. In that role, he was appointed to work alongside Ding Darling, who became the chief of the then U.S. Bureau of Biology, to figure out how to rebuild our landscape to support ducks again. And as part of that task, they created the federal duck stamp program. I guess I didn't have a slide specifically about that. If you're not familiar with waterfowl stamps, every A duck hunter has to buy a federal duck stamp, and 98 cents on the dollar of each of those stamps goes directly to wetland conservation or easement. So that money comes to the federal government, to Fish and Wildlife, and then it's reallocated to state agencies to be able to do conservation work. So it does make up a pretty significant amount of money for purchasing or conserving habitat lands for wildlife. Sure, yeah. So every year there's a federal competition to design what the duck stamp looks like that artists can apply to. There's both a nationwide one, and then there's also one for children, the junior duck stamp art. Someone else that was kind of a key player as we talk about Firebrands of the Refuge system was a man named J. Clark Salyer. He was hired by Ding Darling to essentially be the chief of national wildlife refuges. And he also worked alongside Leopold and tried to take Leopold's theory and put it in action on the landscape. He was a very big man with a loud voice. He hated flying, so he was given a car and allowed to drive across the United States. And the stories I've read have talked about how he would go from refuge to refuge to go see what work they were doing on the landscape and think about how we could improve it to work more cohesively together. And he was responsible for helping to plan where there are refuges. So during the time that he served as the chief of refuges, he helped grow the National Wildlife Refuge System from 1.5 million acres to more than 29 million acres by the time he retired in 1961. I found a quote that said within 6 weeks of being appointed, he had driven 18,000 miles and drawn up plans for 600,000 acres of new refuge lands. So again, pretty influential person to take the reins and get started on this really new project at the time. Of course, the lock and dam system really changed what the habitat looked like on the river. This photo is from 1935, Lock and Dam 7 near La Crescent. The lock and dams were all started being built in the 1930s, and Congress authorized the creation of the lock and dams partly due to concerns that the Midwest economy would lessen if we didn't have an economical way to move products, whether that was agricultural products or industrial products. At that time, the railroads really couldn't handle the amount of inventory that farmers and businessmen were trying to ship. It was not the first time that there had been conversations about deepening the river for navigation purposes. There was already a 4.5-foot deep channel in the 1880s that was created through wing dams and closed dams. If you've ever seen maps of the river, you'll see where there are rock groins across the river that help direct the flow of water to deepen that channel. And that we went from a 4.5-foot deep channel in the 1880s to a 6-foot channel around 1900. And then at this point, when we've started to have more innovations in the type of boats being used, boats could then have an 8.5-foot draft. So they went for a 9-foot deep channel through the creation of the lock and dams. As far as the influence on habitat, totally changed the way the river was shaped. So right below the lock and dams, we kept some of that original habitat type where you have little braided river channels with forested areas in the middle. In the middle of the pools created by the lock and dam, you get more of that marshy habitat with deeper open water. And then at the very bottom of the pool, it's more silted in, that's where the sediment tends to land. So totally changed what that environment looked like, for better and for worse. So it was a very controversial decision to be able to put the lock and dams in place. There were a lot of differing opinions between state and federal agencies on whether it would be a positive or a negative thing. For the Fish and Wildlife Service, one of the benefits that we saw was creating more open habitat for ducks to perpetuate that marshland habitat. So for better or worse, there were positive and negatives to come out of that change in habitat. So It's a lot to try to understand all of this information, but I found a quote from one of the environmental impact studies of Pool 5A that says, the impoundment abruptly changed the river bottoms from an area of wide fluctuations in pool levels, ranging from floods in the spring to drying out in the summer, to an area of semi-stabilized water, in which while spring floods still occur, the bottoms do not dry out in the summer. Thus, instead of wooded islands and dry marshes, we now have excellent marsh and aquatic habitat with fairly stable water levels throughout the year. So again, it really changed from kind of a seasonally wet and dry environment to having much more stable water levels. Shifting into the 40s and 50s, of course, we can't talk about the history of our country without mentioning World War II. The Second World War did really impact the refuge, and that staff were called away to serve, and we didn't have the same amounts of funding and resources available. But despite the impacts of the war, it was still a pretty influential time for change on the refuge. I enjoyed this photo from, I think this was 1940 at the Winona District. All of the staff in their much more formal uniforms than we have today. The other bullets I have up here are maybe not as exciting for everyone sitting here, but in 1943, the Upper Mississippi River Conservation Committee is formed, and that was one of the first cohesive efforts between state conservation organizations and federal agencies to work together to try to cohesively manage the river. So that organization was primarily formed to try to streamline fishing regulations. So you can imagine the refuge travels through 4 states. All of the states have different regulations, and then refuge regulations on top of those can be pretty confusing for anyone going out on the river to understand what you can and can't do. So that organization has grown from simply concentrating on fishing rules to try to work cohesively across many different wildlife management issues. One of the other things to come about in this time period is that the Fish and Wildlife Service created a river basin study program, and the emphasis of this program was to understand the impacts of federal water projects. So after the lock and dams are put in place, it was a very experimental project. Nobody really totally understood what the impacts would be, but like I mentioned, there were positive and negative impacts of changing that habitat. And this program was to recognize that we probably should take into account how anything we do on the water is going to influence the habitat for wildlife and resulting impacts on people. And this program was really the precursor to the National Environmental Policy Act, which went into place in the late 1960s and now requires any federal agency who's going to undergo a project to consider the impacts of their work on wildlife. So today, if we want to put in a new canoe trail or build a new facility, we have to go through the National Environmental Policy Act to assess the impact of that action on the habitat for wildlife. And then in 1956, the Fish and Wildlife Service is renamed to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and we have the name we carry today. So what's happening with habitat management in the 1940s and 50s? Well, I mentioned the lock and dams really changed what the river looked like. So changing from the braided river channels to more open marshlands, we start to see a lot of changes in the plant communities. So where you used to have forests, now we're seeing the growth of aquatic plants like smartweed, pondweeds, bulrush, wild rice, wild celery, which were pretty important foods for waterfowl. And being a federal agency charged with protecting migratory wildlife, ducks were a big thing for the agency to try to perpetuate. So they were looking at what kinds of food were available for ducks, where that food was located, and then we did some collecting of seed. This gentleman is harvesting pondweed seeds from what was called the Bad Axe ponds, which I believe is Genoa National Fish Hatchery today, to try to redistribute that seed. I've gotten many questions over the years about whether or not we planted wild rice or wild celery, and I did not find any evidence it was planted, but those seeds do self-seed across the river kind of as that habitat changed and those plants began to take over more of the habitat there, which are really critical food sources for many species of ducks. And then we did continue to grow agricultural crops along the refuge to help supplement food in the wintertime. Something else that was a big project for the refuge at this time was wood duck production. So in the 1920s, wood ducks were almost extinct. There were very little wood ducks left, partly due to the lumber industry. So wood ducks are unique in that they make their nests in the tree cavities made by woodpeckers or other animals, and they really depend on having forests right alongside the river for their habitat. So there were many studies done on what type of artificial habitat we could create for wood ducks, and you might still see some of those wood duck boxes out along the river today. So this was one of the refuge managers from the Prairie du Chien district in 1954 holding a prototype wood duck box that was put up and monitored around the refuge. And about this time, we start to see a more formal process for reporting bird numbers. So I mentioned waterfowl production was a big thing, and refuges were responsible for reporting how many species of birds utilized the refuge. And we get some real formal forms with specific counts of this many species of this duck, which of course all had to be estimates, but it was incredible to see bird numbers really start to increase at this time compared to when the refuge was first created. Something different too is that there were many sportsmen's clubs along the river that help stock wildlife species. So if you've been to Goose Island before, the Badger State sportsmen actually raised mallard ducks that they released on the refuge to try to help supplement those populations, as well as I believe geese and pheasants. So they were one of many partner organizations that helped to kind of rebuild wildlife populations. So I just pulled a photo from one of the annual narratives, and you can see the estimates of what all the different populations of birds looked like on the refuge. And we're seeing now about 400,000 birds estimated to use the refuge in 1948. So we're finally kind of seeing that comeback in wildlife populations. In addition to wildlife populations increasing, in the time after the Second World War, we start to see huge increases in public recreation. So the economy was doing better, home construction was building or growing, roadways had increased, so it was a lot easier for people to access wild spaces. So on the refuge, we particularly see growth in beach use and fishing. And at this time in 1954, there were already 500,000 people estimated to be using the refuge lands. So we still report all these numbers today, and you can, in this chart, in all of the different districts on the river, they're estimating that they had more than 350,000 people using the refuge for fishing. I have no idea what miscellaneous was. I have a feeling that was beach use, swimming, photography, wildlife observation, all of the different public use activities folks do on the refuge today. I also found it interesting to see some of the frustration of staff in trying to figure out how to manage people to manage wildlife. So I pulled this from the 1950 annual narrative. The number of people seeking recreation on the upper Mississippi River continues to increase each year. On weekends or holidays when the weather is favorable, almost every available fishing spot and camp area is crowded to capacity. Boats of every size, shape, and description, from rubber rafts to luxuriant cruisers, are, figuratively speaking, as thick as flies. The 2 supervised beaches are visited by many thousands every week. A good hot day will find nearly 1,000 at each beach. So far, there has been no epidemic to cause any curtailment of any recreational activities, nor any serious accidents to dampen the vacationing spirits. So we're kind of starting to see that crux of how do we manage recreation on a national wildlife refuge with the needs of wildlife, and at the same time, manage that with the needs of the economy, working alongside the Army Corps of Engineers on the navigation channel. Still a challenge today in figuring out how to find that balance. So at this point in the refuge history, there were areas within the refuge that were closed to hunting, but those areas might change year to year as the habitat changed. So it was very confusing for hunters going out on the river to understand where they could and could not hunt. And as the number of hunters grew, there were many complaints about poor sportsmanship in these areas where hunters would hang out right outside of where the closed areas were, waiting for birds to come in and out of those areas to be able to shoot them as they exited or entered. At this point too, the beaver populations were starting to come back from being overtrapped, which was really interesting too, to see descriptions of people complaining about beavers after in the earlier narratives, I found sections where they celebrate, we saw a raccoon today, like one raccoon. Or beavers were actually relocated onto the refuge from northern Wisconsin in the early years as well to try to bring back those populations. And again, signposting of the refuge boundary continues to take a lot of time. When the ice freezes over the river, it really shifts where those signs are located. They get knocked down by the weather, and it's something that we have to continue to do every year. So they mentioned that a great deal of time and energy is required to keep signs in such condition that the average hunter will have no excuse for going into them. And we now have specific closed areas that don't change year to year. And those closed areas have signs that are posted every 1/8 of a mile. So we do still have staff who spend quite a bit of time going out to maintain those signs. Moving into the 1960s and 70s, we had some pretty significant floods in the 50s and 60s. And the 1965 flood year, the narrative mentioned that it caused about $250,000 in infrastructure damage of refuge facilities along the river. And that was about $2.4 million today. So pretty crazy to see pictures of some of the maintenance facilities well underwater, and thinking about, again, managing all of the signs and boat landings along the river. In 1966, the National Wildlife Refuge System Act was the first comprehensive act that really outlays how refuges should be managed. And this requires that any public use that occurs on the refuge has to be compatible with our purpose. So when the refuge was created by Congress, we have specific language that states what the purpose of the refuge is. On the Upper Miss Refuge, because it's so old, our congressional purpose is to be a place for breeding and migratory birds, for fur bearers and their habitats, for fish, and like accompanying plants and wildflowers, which sounds, like very basic and obvious. But at that point in the 1920s, when it was created for that purpose, a lot of those animals were not present on the landscape anymore. So we didn't have a ton of ducks, we didn't have a ton of fur bearers, and the plant communities had really been impacted by other activities on the river. Today, we have what we call the Big Six. Our 6 priority public uses are hunting, fishing, wildlife interpretation, photography, environmental education, and interpretation. So anything outside of those Big Six activities, we have to go through a compatibility determination process. So what that means is we look at what the activity is, whether it can be done without interfering with our purpose, what I mentioned, and whether we have the time to administer that activity. So it could be things like archaeology on the refuge, research, silent sports like kayaking, canoeing, bicycling, fat tire biking, any of these new forms of recreation that pop up. It gives us the opportunity to try to manage that use when we have conflicts between users. So for example, we had requests to try to shut down the river in the winter, or to shut down a section of the river for an ice sailing competition. They make sailboats that can glide across the ice, but we declined that use because it would materially interfere with ice fishing, which was a traditional use on the refuge. And to be honest, we don't have the staff to try to go out there and shut down the river like that. So an example of where compatibility determinations might come into play. And of course, the Endangered Species Act was created in 1973 and does really play a role in habitat management and gives us the ability to help protect wildlife in a different way. So at this point in the 60s and 70s, staff are going out to do weekly waterfowl counts, again, to try to really quantify how the efforts of habitat management were resulting or not resulting in higher wildlife populations. And these numbers were sent in to our chief of the refuge system. And I did find some scolding messages when there wasn't enough information about the counts, or they didn't feel that the counts were done thoroughly enough. So still at this time, most districts only had a few staff, so it was a lot of work to try to go out and count ducks every week, interview hunters about how many ducks they had harvested in the hunt, and then try to figure out both in the migration season and the nesting season how many birds were present on the landscape. I enjoyed this photo. There was a particularly interesting research project going on at that time to try to capture wood ducks to be able to count how wood duck populations were doing. And that study, one of the refuge staff used his dog as a method to go catch baby wood ducks and count them and band them. So pretty neat to be able to use dogs in your line of work. We're not allowed to bring our dogs to the office today, but it was a fairly effective way to be able to capture birds without hurting them. I mentioned they were doing extensive hunter surveys. Duck banding was taking place for many different species, not just wood ducks. And at that point, we were still continuing to stock wildlife through the partner organizations. The first bald eagle nested on the refuge in 1978. So if you think about wildlife policy, at this point there were really no eagles because of DDT, the agricultural chemical DDT. So as our wildlife policies changed and we stopped using that pesticide, we finally start to see birds coming back to nest on the refuge. So this bald eagle in 1978 being the first one to nest, today there's more than 300 active bald eagle nests up and down the span of the refuge. I also just had to include this photo. We also aren't currently using demolition equipment in our day-to-day jobs, but one of the challenges of the lock and dam system was how the sediment moves on the river. So in partnering with a state agency, one of the habitat management projects at this time was to try to create more channels in the river for fish habitat. So they use incendiary devices to blow up a channel across the river that would have like a 3 to 4 foot depth for fish habitat. Something else at the time with the lock and dam system is that there wasn't a whole lot of strategy in where dredge sand material was placed. They usually placed it somewhere convenient, which made fabulous beach camping locations for folks getting out to enjoy the refuge for recreation, but they were starting to see some negative impacts on wildlife habitat. So some of our first conversations happen at this point of how do we better utilize dredge sand material and where do we put it so that it's not negatively impacting the wildlife that's there. By the mid-1960s or late 1960s, we've gone from 500,000 visitors per year to 1.5 million visits, so pretty significant growth. At this point, we had our first public use staff hired, so moving beyond the 1 or 2 person district staff to try to incorporate education into what we do. At that point, staff were going out to conduct boater surveys to talk to visitors who were out enjoying the beaches and find out more about what they were interested in doing there and how they viewed the refuge as far as whether they felt it should be used for wildlife, for recreation, or a combination of both. At that point, we also had huge issues with littering on the island. So you can think back to the quote I shared about how many people were using them. There was a lot of debris that was left behind by recreationists. And this was another quote from one of the narratives. It's frightening to realize that at least a third of the people interviewed in the voter surveys think our job is to provide them with toilets on the sandbars, shelters, fire pits, trash cans, and the like. This 1/3 is a technologically bred group that expects all the amenities of society wherever it goes. This group deserves our attention through a well-developed, resource-oriented recreation program. So at this point, we really shift from being an agency that's primarily focused just on wildlife conservation and habitat management to thinking more about how do we manage people to be able to manage wildlife. Trapping has finally come back on the refuge. I mentioned there were reports of being excited about just seeing a few animals on the landscape. And this 1966 report says, the muskrat capacity of the Upper Mississippi Refuge knows no bounds. The 1966-7 harvest far exceeded all past records when 228,000 plus muskrats were taken by about 1,200 trappers. The total fur value returned to the community was $226,000, or about $2 million today. So it's pretty impressive to me to see how at that time, trapping was still a very lucrative activity on the refuge, and how important the refuge was, not just for the benefits of wildlife, but also the economy. I mentioned having that shift from being more focused on just habitat management to trying to think more broadly about incorporating people into the work that we do. So we start to see the first environmental education and interpretation programs happening on the refuge. Some of them were particularly to address litter issues on the beaches, but also to help people understand the significance of the work that we do and involve them in that work. And that's kind of the point where we transition to what the agency is like today. I've decided to focus on this, early history of the first 50 years, just because I know many of you were here for the 1980s and beyond, and probably lived through what our current history is like. And shifting from, the 1970s today, there are some ways that you can help us to help shape the future of the refuge and the next 100 years to come. I think some of my takeaways through going through this 50 years of history was that we have a pretty unique history and the strength in our being able to work with states, non-governmental partners, and other federal agencies to manage a really incredibly dynamic and diverse place. There's not too many other national wildlife refuges that have so much recreation, the unique partnership with the Army Corps, and then trying to incorporate a very diverse public who has very diverse interests in how the wildlife and habitat are managed. I mentioned needing to balance commerce, recreation, and wildlife. Again, it's a pretty complex challenge to try to honor the importance of the economic impact of the refuge, honor the American public's right to recreate and get out and enjoy the phenomenal place we have in our backyard, and try to figure out how do we conserve this area so that the species that are here now continue to be around for future generations to enjoy. And what does that look like in the face of challenges like climate change and invasive species and continued population growth? So as much as it can be a huge challenge, I think there's a lot of hope in the connectivity that we have with our partners and with our community. I appreciate so much that you all came out today. One of the other things that just blew my mind was that this was a experiment of how we go about doing this, of how we go about managing this land. The lock and dams that were put in place in the 30s are pretty special and unique to this area, and nobody really knew what that would be like. Or thinking about how do we bring wildlife back? How do we manipulate habitat? What does that look like? And we continue to try to manage with the best available science, but There's also just incredible minds in this community who have had the opportunity to shape what that looks like and coming up with some of these research projects and things that we've tried to improve the habitat and continue to try. I mentioned the Army Corps of Engineers. We're responsible for putting the lock and dams in place, and part of our current partnership with them is to find ways to restore the floodplain forest habitat that was lost due to the creation of the lock and dams. So we have some pretty cool research projects going on with the Army Corps of Engineers foresters to try to do things like raise the elevation of some of the islands to be able to help the floodplain forest survive sustained flood events, and to think about how we resist the impacts of climate change or impacts of invasive species to provide the best possible habitat. So even in the face of challenges, there's just some incredibly cool partnerships, both with federal agencies, state agencies, local universities, nonprofit groups that really make me very excited to see what the next 50 years will bring on the refuge. The other thing that really blows my mind is just how much passion is catching, that our story starts with Will Dilg and his efforts to motivate his friends, to motivate sports people, anglers, to petition Congress for the creation of the refuge, and how much their impact of having a voice and speaking up for the things that they cared about created the refuge. And there were not that many wildlife refuges at that time. So phenomenal to see what the power of what started as a small group of people could really share that passion and expand it to do something really meaningful. I also think that the community here has a very special connection to place. And I'm sure you all have your own stories of how you value the refuge here. But I think that that connection is really powerful and something we may underestimate, that we have this opportunity to get to know the space really well and how much that connection influences our lives and the lives of the people that we're friends with and our family that we influence. And I don't think that that's always the same in other parts of the country with other national wildlife refuges. So I would hold on to that connection to place. As far as how you can help shape the future of the refuge, we do have volunteer opportunities. Most of the work that we do is on the ground habitat management. So that might be native gardening, removing invasive species, or planting native shrubs, native trees in areas that we're trying to restore. If you're into the more people side of things, I mentioned we'll have a big special event going on in June, and I'll certainly be looking for volunteers to help with that event. We also have several friends groups that help support the refuge. So they're individual nonprofit organizations, and they help be our bridge to the community. The Friends of the Refuge Mississippi River Pools 7 and 8 is the friends group for the La Crosse district. They have a beautiful nature store in our visitor center, but they also go out to community events like Youth Outdoor Fest, the Earth Fair at Myrick Park coming up at the end of April, and other activities in the community that just expand our reach when we're limited by staff. And they are also always looking for volunteers and board members to help continue to expand their organization. There's also a ton of incredible community science programs that you can access if you have a computer or a smartphone. I have a few favorites. If you're into birding, there's a program called eBird where you can track the birds that you see and keep a list. There's another program called Merlin that it has a really cool sound recording ability where if you go for a walk and you hit the record button, it'll tell you all the different birds that it's hearing and help you learn about birds. There's so many different community science programs that do things like track monarch migration or mayfly emergence, or the bird apps that I mentioned. There's plant ID apps, and all of those help feed into a bigger picture for the scientific community of what's here. I've heard statistics that as an agency, Fish and Wildlife has the capacity to monitor about 27% of threatened and endangered species, like across the nation. That's what we have the capacity to do. So anything that you can do to help get out on the landscape and help submit your observations of plants, wildlife, the phenology or the changes in the seasons of things like when the buds emerge and when the monarchs arrive, all help us build this much bigger picture of the status of our habitats and wildlife. So it may seem like a small thing to go put in the 5 robins you saw an eBird yesterday, but it all is utilized and helps build a larger picture of the well-being of our environment. So there are small things we can do that might be kind of fun and still help feed into the bigger picture of our world. There's other things that we can do as individuals, whether that is planting native species. If you have a garden at home, or I have a balcony, I have little balcony plants. The native species that were here pre-European settlement provide the best possible food and nesting material for insects, for birds, for many species of wildlife. We can also try to use fewer chemicals on our lawns and gardens. Those chemicals can run off into our riverways and can negatively impact beneficial insects and accordingly the animals that eat them. Something we've done at our visitor center is we got a grant during COVID to put up new decals on our windows. Birds are very impacted by glass, whether that's residential glass or in cities and skyscrapers. And anything we can do to prevent window strikes really makes a difference for them. And the tighter the grouping of your window decorations, the more effective they are. It can be something like the decals that we got, or it can even be like tempera paint. I've seen folks make like curtains with just string to hang down in front of the windows that will move in the breeze and help the birds recognize that the glass is there. If we can turn our lights off outside of our houses at nighttime during the migration season, it helps reduce confusion for birds that may be thrown off of their migration course by the lights around our houses. And of course, anything we can do to use less plastic. I'm sure you've heard about all the plastic that ends up in the oceans and rivers, and animals eat that plastic and it can be really hurtful for them. So little things we can do. I have one more slide and then I'll take questions at the end. And then of course, we can invite somebody that we know to spend time outdoors and help to build that positive relationship with the environment and help cultivate that connection to place and the passion that we have. Again, I just think we have such a powerful opportunity in the community that we have here, and that your experience is moving for people that you know, probably in a way that we might not fully realize.